Science prides itself on one sacred promise: the relentless, fearless pursuit of truth. That is the story we tell ourselves. That is the story printed in every textbook, posted on every university wall, celebrated in every Nobel acceptance speech. But what happens when the truth makes those in power look like fools? What happens when a discovery buried beneath the sand of the Mojave Desert threatens to overturn not just a theory, not just a chapter in a textbook, but the entire foundational story of how human beings first came to stand on American soil? The answer, it turns out, is not more science. The answer is suppression, ridicule, defunding, and a career-ending purge that would make any authoritarian government proud. For over half a century, a single idea has dominated American archaeology with the force of religious doctrine. It goes like this: the first humans to reach the Americas crossed a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska roughly 13,000 years ago. They were the Clovis people, named after a small town in New Mexico, where their distinctive stone spear points were first discovered in the 1930s. They spread southward. They hunted the great megafauna into extinction. They became the ancestors of all Native American peoples. End of story. Close the textbook. Move on. This is the story known as Clovis First, and for decades, it was not treated as a hypothesis. It was not presented as a best current estimate subject to revision. It was enforced, sometimes viciously, as absolute, unchallengeable fact. But here is what the gatekeepers of that story did not want you to know. Beneath the unforgiving sands of the Mojave Desert in Southern California, in a place of raw geological silence where summer temperatures climb past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the horizon dissolves into heat haze, there exists a site that has been quietly, persistently, stubbornly refusing to cooperate with the official version of history. It is called the Calico Early Man Site, and within its ancient sediment layers so old they were laid down before the last ice age, before the woolly mammoth reached its peak, before much of the world's current geography even existed, archaeologists found stone tools, not crude, ambiguous pebbles. Not rocks that merely looked vaguely interesting if you squinted hard enough, but precisely shaped, deliberately flaked, lithic artifacts bearing the unmistakable signatures of intentional human craftsmanship. Tools that, according to the geological record encasing them, are somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years old. 100 to 200,000 years. At a time when mainstream science insisted that human beings had not yet set foot anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. The discovery did not just threaten to shatter the human evolutionary timeline for the Americas, it threatened to expose something far more uncomfortable: the terrifying dark side of what passes for objective scientific inquiry. How the academic establishment, when cornered by inconvenient evidence, does not ask better questions. It destroys the people asking them. This is the story of a resilient female archaeologist working alone in the desert heat, of a legendary scientist who staked his entire reputation on stones that most of his colleagues refused to even examine. Of a decades-long battle between evidence and dogma, between open inquiry and institutional power. Of careers destroyed, reputations shredded, and human lives poured into the desert sand in search of a truth that the academic world was simply not prepared to accept. Whether the stones of Calico are 200,000-year-old human tools or nature's strange joke, the greatest mystery here is not found in the rocks themselves. It is found in how science chose to respond to them. And that response should send a chill down the spine of anyone who believes that knowledge is the one thing human beings always, reliably, bravely pursue. To understand what was found at Calico, you first need to understand where it was found, because the Mojave Desert does not invite discovery, it repels it. The Mojave stretches across southeastern California and into Nevada and Arizona in a sprawling, sun-scorched emptiness that most people cross as quickly as possible on their way to somewhere else. The landscape is severe and austere. Dry lake beds shimmer in the distance. Creosote bushes dot the pale, dusty earth. The silence is so total that it has its own physical weight. In summer, the air shimmers and buckles, and the ground retains enough heat at midnight to keep you awake with its warmth. It does not seem like the kind of place where you would go looking for the oldest evidence of human life in the Americas. But Ruth DeEtte Simpson had been looking there since the 1940s. Simpson was, by any measure, an extraordinary figure. Born in 1911, she entered archaeology at a time when the field was overwhelmingly male. Not just dominated by men, but actively organized to exclude women from serious professional consideration. Women in mid-century American archaeology were expected to be assistants, catalogers, illustrators, laboratory technicians. They were not expected to lead excavations. They were not expected to challenge established theory. They were certainly not expected to find the oldest human artifacts ever discovered in the Western Hemisphere and defend that finding against the collective fury of the scientific establishment for the rest of their lives. Simpson did all of those things. She had been surveying the Mojave's Calico Hills, a series of ancient alluvial fans deposited at the base of the San Bernardino Mountains since 1942, working for the San Bernardino County Museum. The Calico Hills sit at the margins of what was once Pleistocene Lake Mannix, a large freshwater lake that existed during wetter periods of the Ice Age, before drying into the desert landscape that exists today. The area is geologically rich, and Simpson understood it intimately. She had spent years walking its terrain, studying its stratigraphy, cataloging its surface finds. Then, in the mid-1950s, something changed. She began finding flaked stones, lithic specimens whose fracture patterns seemed impossible to explain through purely natural means. These were not ordinary rocks. The Mojave Desert is full of rocks, but these particular specimens bore the kinds of characteristics that archaeologists and geologists are trained to recognize as evidence of intentional human modification. Conchoidal fractures, bulbs of percussion, precise edge angles, platform preparation. In plain English, these rocks looked like someone had made them, on purpose. The problem, the staggering, almost incomprehensible problem, was where they were found. The geological deposits encasing these objects were not recent, they were ancient. The sediment layers at Calico had been dated through multiple independent methods to somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years before the present. According to the orthodox timeline of human prehistory in the Americas, that was simply impossible. No human being was supposed to have been anywhere near North America that long ago. Simpson understood the implications immediately. She also understood the danger of making such an extraordinary claim without extraordinary evidence. She had spent enough years in professional archaeology to know that the field did not reward iconoclasts. It punished them. She needed more than her own observations. She needed data. She needed excavation. She needed someone with enough institutional weight to force the academic establishment to take the site seriously. She needed a giant. And as the 1950s turned toward the 1960s, word of the Calico findings began to travel through the informal networks of international archaeology, the conference conversations, the correspondence, the quiet professional gossip that moves ideas from one corner of the field to another long before they appear in any journal. The word eventually reached a man who had spent his career overturning timelines that other scientists thought were settled forever. His name was Louis Leakey. And when Louis Leakey heard about unusual stones in an ancient California desert deposit that shouldn't have been there, he got on a plane. The geology of impossibility. Before we follow Leakey to Calico, we need to understand exactly why these stones were so threatening to the scientific establishment, and why the geological context they were found in was not an ambiguity to be explained away, but a fact to be reckoned with. The alluvial fans of the Calico Hills are well understood geologically. They were deposited in multiple distinct episodes over a very long period, with each episode representing a different era of climatic and hydrological activity in the region. The material from the Yermo Formation, the specific deposit in which the most significant Calico specimens were found, has been dated through uranium series methods, paleomagnetism, and other dating techniques to the Middle Pleistocene epoch. Middle Pleistocene, roughly 100,000 to 780,000 years ago. At the lower end of that range, we are talking about a period when Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, had not yet fully emerged as a distinct species in Africa. The most recent estimates suggest that our species appeared somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago on the African continent, which means that if the Calico artifacts are genuinely of human manufacture and genuinely embedded in deposits from the deeper end of the Yermo Formation's date range, they represent either an impossibly early presence of Homo sapiens in the Americas or the presence of some earlier hominin species that no one has yet identified. Both possibilities are extraordinary. Both possibilities would rewrite not just American prehistory, but global human evolutionary history. This is why the Calico site did not merely irritate the archaeological establishment. It threatened to demolish the very foundations of the story that establishment had spent decades constructing and defending. And it is why, when Louis Leakey arrived to examine the evidence, what followed was not a dispassionate scientific inquiry. It was the opening salvo of a war. Louis Seymour Bazette Leakey was, in the early 1960s, the most famous archaeologist and paleoanthropologist in the world. He had earned that fame through decades of extraordinary fieldwork in East Africa, primarily in the Olduvai Gorge of Tanzania, where he and his wife Mary had discovered the fossilized remains of human ancestors that pushed our evolutionary timeline back millions of years beyond what anyone had previously believed possible. The Leakeys had found Australopithecus, Boise. They had found Homo habilis. They had found evidence of stone tool use stretching back 1.7 million years. Every major discovery they made in East Africa had been met with initial skepticism, then grudging acceptance, Then, integration into the revised canon of human prehistory. Louis Leakey was not a man who was afraid of challenging established timelines. He had made a career of it. He was also, by the early 1960s, approaching 60 years old. He had suffered health problems. His marriage to Mary had become complicated. His relationship with the British scientific establishment, which had always been ambivalent about his flamboyant, public-facing approach to science, was strained. There were people within the field who had been waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to overreach, waiting for the moment when Louis Leakey's famous instinct for significance would finally lead him off a cliff. When Ruth Simpson made contact with him about the Calico site in the early 1960s, Leakey did not dismiss her findings. He read her reports. He studied her photographs. He asked careful, technical questions. And then, in 1963, he flew to California to see the site for himself. What happened when he examined the Calico Stones has been described in various ways, depending on who is doing the telling. By those who later came to oppose the site's validity, Leakey's reaction is portrayed as reckless enthusiasm, an aging showman, past his prime, desperate for one more dramatic discovery, grabbing onto Ruth Simpson's stones because he wanted them to be tools rather than because they were. By those who were present, the account is different. Leakey was methodical. He was careful. He examined specimen after specimen, using the same rigorous lithic analysis techniques he had applied to the tools of Olduvai Gorge for 30 years. He turned each piece in his hands. He studied the fracture patterns, the platform angles, the edge morphology. He asked about the geological context. He asked about the provenance of each find. He took his time, and then he said, "These are human tools. These are human tools." 3 words that would set off one of the longest, most bitter, most consequential controversies in the history of American archaeology. The National Geographic gamble. Louis Leakey's endorsement of the Calico site was not merely a personal opinion. In the context of 1960s archaeology, a statement by Leakey carried the weight of institutional authority. He was not just a famous scientist. He was the president of the Pan-African Congress on Prehistory. He was a trustee of the National Geographic Society. He was the man who, more than any other single individual, had demonstrated that the story of human origins was radically older and more complex than anyone had previously imagined. When Leakey said the Calico Stones were human artifacts, people listened. More concretely, funding followed. In 1964, with Leakey's active sponsorship, a formal excavation program began at the Calico Early Man site. National Geographic provided significant support. The San Bernardino County Museum committed institutional resources. Ruth Simpson, who had been working the site on her own limited means for years, suddenly found herself at the center of a professionally supported, nationally funded research project. The initial excavation was designed according to rigorous archaeological standards. 2 master pits, designated Pit 1 and Pit 2, were opened and excavated with meticulous attention to stratigraphic control. Every object removed from the dig was cataloged, measured, photographed, and analyzed. The team maintained detailed field notes, soil sample records, and provenance documentation for each specimen. This was not a casual treasure hunt. It was systematic scientific fieldwork. What they found deepened the mystery. In the excavation of Pit 1 and Pit 2, the team recovered hundreds of lithic specimens, that bore what appeared to be unmistakable signs of human modification. Flakes with bulbs of percussion, the rounded, convex protrusion produced when a stone is struck intentionally by a hammerstone, were found in statistically significant numbers. Edge preparation, the deliberate working of a stone's margin to create a functional cutting or scraping surface, was documented repeatedly. Some specimens appeared to be formal tool types, scrapers, choppers, worked flakes with distinct utilized edges. The geological context remained consistent and deeply troubling for orthodox chronology. The specimens were embedded in the undisturbed Yermo Formation, demonstrably in situ, not transported by water or wind into the layer from some later time period. They were there because something had put them there, in that specific geological moment, more than 100,000 years ago. The team published preliminary findings. Leakey stood firmly behind the site in public and professional forums. The excavation continued, season after season, with growing optimism. And then the sky fell in. The first volleys. The opposition did not arrive as a single, organized response. It came in waves, and each wave was slightly more aggressive than the last. The first critics acknowledged the site's existence and the sincerity of its investigators, but questioned the interpretation. Perhaps, they suggested, the fracture patterns on the Calico Stones were not evidence of human manufacture. Perhaps they were the result of natural processes, geological forces, seismic activity, the pressure of overlying sediments, the violent mechanics of flash floods in a desert environment. In geological parlance, such naturally fractured stones are called geofacts, objects that look like artifacts but are not. This was, on its face, a legitimate scientific objection. The distinction between artifacts and geofacts is genuinely difficult, genuinely contested, and genuinely important in lithic analysis. Not every flaked stone is a human-made tool. Nature is a powerful, and sometimes surprisingly precise, flint knapper. Desert environments in particular, with their cycles of extreme heat and cold, their occasional violent water events, and their tectonic activity, can produce stones with fracture patterns that superficially resemble human workmanship. The Calico team took this objection seriously. They responded with increasingly detailed lithic analyses. They brought in independent experts. They commissioned comparative studies of geofact assemblages from geologically similar contexts to demonstrate that the Calico specimens fell outside the range of natural fracture patterns. They documented the statistical distributions of fracture angles, platform characteristics, and flake morphology across hundreds of specimens. Their conclusion: the Calico assemblage could not be explained by natural fracturing alone. The critics' conclusion: yes, it could. And here, in this technical back and forth, something began to shift. What had started as a genuine scientific debate began to calcify into something else, something less rational, something more tribal. The academic establishment was not simply skeptical of Calico, it was frightened of it. To understand the war that erupted over the Calico site, you need to understand the science at its center. Not just the outline of it, not just the vocabulary, the actual, granular, sometimes maddeningly technical science of how you tell a human-made stone tool from a naturally fractured rock. It turns out, this is one of the most complex questions in all of archaeology, and the Calico site became its most contested battlefield. Reading the language of stone. When a human being intentionally flakes a stone, the process known as knapping, They produce a highly specific set of physical signatures. These signatures occur because of the predictable mechanical properties of certain stone types, primarily flint, chert, obsidian, and other fine-grained siliceous rocks that fracture conchoidally. Conchoidal fracture is what happens when force is applied to such a stone. The fracture propagates in a smooth, curved pattern, like the rings on the inside of a clamshell. This is the fracture pattern you see on freshly broken glass. It is also what makes these stones useful for toolmaking. The fracture is predictable, controllable, and produces reliably sharp edges. When a knapper strikes a stone with another rock, the hammerstone, they produce a characteristic suite of features on the resulting flake. The most diagnostic of these is the bulb of percussion, a rounded, convex protrusion on the interior face of the flake, centered directly below the point of impact. Think of it as the physical record of where the hammerstone hit. Accompanying the bulb is frequently an arrelure scar, a small secondary flake scar adjacent to the bulb, and a diffuse ring of concentric ripple marks radiating outward from the impact point. These features, bulb of percussion, arrelure scar, ripple marks, predictable platform angle, constitute the core diagnostic suite for intentional lithic reduction. When they appear together, repeatedly, on multiple specimens from a single assemblage, they are considered strong evidence of human napping. Now here is where the controversy around Calico becomes genuinely complex. Nature can also produce conchoidal fractures. A rock struck by another falling rock. A stone compressed by the weight of overlying sediment. A flint cobble subjected to the freeze-thaw cycles of desert temperature extremes. A pebble tumbled in a violent flash flood. All of these natural processes can produce fractures that superficially resemble the work of a human napper. The key word is superficially, because when you examine the details, the natural fractures and the human-made fractures should, in theory, be distinguishable. Natural fractures tend to lack the specific combination of features that appears on intentionally struck flakes. Natural fractures tend to produce random edge angles rather than the consistent, purposive platform preparation of napped tools. Natural fractures rarely produce the specific size sorting patterns that characterize the debris of napping, where you find the large flakes and the small chips, and the microdetritus that together represent a complete reduction sequence. In theory, in practice, in a 100,000-year-old desert deposit that has been subjected to unknown geological stresses over an enormous span of time, the line between natural and artificial fracture becomes genuinely, agonizingly difficult to draw. This is the technical heart of the Calico controversy, and it is where the debate, if it had remained purely scientific and purely technical, might have been productive and even fascinating. It did not remain purely scientific. The artifacts the establishment refused to examine, among the most damaging indictments of the scientific response to Calico, is not what critics said about the evidence. It is what they did not do. A proper scientific response to a contested claim requires engagement with the evidence. It requires visiting the site, examining the specimens, reviewing the documentation, applying independent analytical techniques to the same material, attempting to replicate the findings, or failing to replicate them through rigorous methodology. What happened instead was something that, if it occurred in any other domain of inquiry, would be considered a profound failure of intellectual integrity. Prominent critics wrote dismissive papers about the Calico assemblage without visiting the site. They published authoritative-sounding refutations without examining the actual specimens. They cited each other's dismissals as evidence that the matter was settled, creating a circular architecture of rejection that had the appearance of scientific consensus, while actually being nothing more than a mutual agreement not to look too carefully at something inconvenient. One particularly notable example, a widely cited critique of the Calico site, published in a major archaeological journal in the 1970s, was authored by a scholar who, by his own admission, had not visited the excavation and had examined only a handful of photographs of specimens, not the actual physical objects. The critique ran to several pages of confident technical analysis based on photographs of objects whose most diagnostic features, the subtle topography of the bulb of percussion, the precise angle of the platform, the character of the ripple marks, can only be fully assessed through hands-on examination, under proper lighting conditions, often with magnification. The Calico team pointed this out repeatedly. They invited critics to visit the site, to examine the specimens in person, to apply whatever analytical methods they preferred. Some critics accepted and came away more uncertain than their published positions suggested. Most declined. The refusals were not accompanied by explanations. They were simply refusals, and in archaeological journals, the reviews continued, authoritative, dismissive, and increasingly disconnected from actual engagement with the physical reality of what had been found in the Mojave Desert. What was happening was not science. It was gatekeeping, dressed in scientific language. The statistical question. One of the most technically significant aspects of the Calico assemblage is its sheer size and internal consistency. By the time the major phase of excavation had concluded, the site had yielded over 11,000 lithic specimens from controlled stratigraphic contexts. 11,000 specimens. When geofact critics argued that natural processes could account for the Calico assemblage, they were arguing that natural processes could produce 11,000 stones with consistent fracture patterns, distributed through a specific geological deposit in a specific geographic area, with internal typological regularities suggesting a coherent technological tradition. The statistical improbability of this argument is significant. Natural fracturing in desert environments does produce lithic material, but it does not produce assemblages with the kind of typological coherence and spatial patterning that characterizes actual archaeological sites. You would not expect nature, operating randomly across a landscape, to produce concentrations of fractured stone in specific locations with specific characteristics pointing to a common technological tradition. Unless, of course, you define geofacts broadly enough to explain away anything inconvenient, which is precisely what some critics began to do. The methodological goalposts shifted. Initially, the argument was that specific Calico specimens could be explained as natural fractures. Then it became that the entire assemblage was geofacts. Then it became that any pre-Clovis claim anywhere in the Americas was inherently suspicious and required an impossibly high standard of proof before it could be considered legitimate. This last position, the demand for a different and more stringent evidentiary standard for pre-Clovis claims than was applied to post-Clovis claims, has a name in the philosophy of science. It is called special pleading, and it is recognized as a logical fallacy. But logical fallacies, when deployed by sufficiently powerful people in sufficiently prestigious journals, have a way of becoming received wisdom, and received wisdom, once established, is extraordinarily resistant to the kind of evidence that Calico was producing from the Mojave sand. To understand why the response to Calico was so ferocious, so organized, and so personal, you need to understand the cultural and institutional dynamics of American archaeology in the latter half of the 20th century. The Clovis first paradigm was not merely a scientific theory, it was an identity. The making of a dogma. The Clovis first model had been built over several decades by some of the most distinguished figures in American archaeology. It rested on an impressive body of evidence. The Clovis lithic tradition was well documented at dozens of sites across North and South America. Radiocarbon dating had established the chronological parameters of the tradition with apparent precision. The archaeological record in the Americas, as it was understood in the mid-20th century, showed a consistent pattern: Clovis sites, followed by Folsom and other Paleo-Indian traditions, followed by the full diversity of pre-Columbian cultures. Everything fit. More importantly, for the social dynamics of the field, Clovis first had become the organizing principle around which American prehistoric archaeology had structured itself. Graduate students were trained within its framework. Research programs were designed around its assumptions. Museum displays were built to illustrate it. The entire intellectual infrastructure of the field presumed it as a baseline. When Ruth Simpson began finding strange stones in Mojave desert deposits, and when Louis Leakey endorsed those findings as evidence of 200,000-year-old human presence in California, they were not simply challenging a theory. They were challenging the professional identity of an entire generation of scholars. They were suggesting that the framework within which thousands of researchers had spent their careers was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong, and they were doing it from outside the traditional centers of American academic power. Simpson was a woman at a time when women in archaeology were still fighting for basic professional respect. Leakey was British, working in Africa, operating outside the institutional networks of American archaeological academia. The Calico team was based at a county museum in San Bernardino, not exactly a prestigious academic address. The establishment response to this challenge was not curious. It was not engaged. It was defensive, territorial, and ultimately vicious. The Clovis Police. The term Clovis Police was not invented by critics of the establishment. It emerged in various forms from within the field itself, used sometimes sardonically by younger archaeologists who had observed firsthand what happened to colleagues who took pre-Clovis claims seriously. The term captures something real about the sociology of the controversy. There was, in mid to late 20th century American archaeology, an informal but powerful enforcement mechanism that operated to maintain the Clovis first paradigm against challenges. This enforcement operated through multiple channels simultaneously. It operated through peer review, where manuscripts reporting pre-Clovis findings were routinely rejected by journals whose editorial boards were dominated by Clovis first adherents, often without adequate review, and sometimes with reviewer comments that were dismissive to the point of contempt. It operated through grant funding, where research proposals focused on pre-Clovis claims found it difficult to secure support from institutions whose advisory panels were populated by the same established scholars who had already decided the matter was closed. It operated through professional reputation, where association with a pre-Clovis site, even in a cautious, analytically rigorous way, could mark a scholar as a crank, a zealot, or a naif. The social cost of serious engagement with Calico, in certain circles of the field, was real and measurable. And it operated through the conference circuit, where papers reporting pre-Clovis evidence were subjected to a quality of criticism dramatically more aggressive than papers reporting Clovis-era findings, regardless of their actual methodological rigor. The cumulative effect of these pressures was a field that had, in a very real sense, closed itself to a category of evidence, not through a formal decision, not through a conscious conspiracy, but through the organic, emergent dynamics of a professional community that had too much invested in a particular answer to tolerate questions that might invalidate it. The double standard of evidence. Perhaps the most intellectually dishonest aspect of the Clovis police's response to pre-Clovis claims was the systematic application of a double standard in evidentiary requirements. Clovis sites were accepted as legitimate archaeological contexts on the basis of evidence that, by the standards being applied to Calico, would have been considered inadequate. The association of Clovis points with megafauna, with woolly mammoths and mastodons and ancient bison, was treated as evidence of both the age and the authenticity of those assemblages, even though similar associations at pre-Clovis sites were dismissed as coincidental or misinterpreted. Radiocarbon dates that supported the Clovis first timeline were accepted without the intense scrutiny applied to dates from pre-Clovis contexts. Dating techniques that were considered reliable when they confirmed the orthodox chronology were suddenly riddled with methodological uncertainties when they suggested something older. This is not science. This is confirmation bias operating at the level of an entire professional community, and its consequences for the people who had committed their careers to the Calico site were severe. Imagine spending years, decades in the desert heat, conducting careful, documented, rigorous field work, and watching the results of that work dismissed by people who had not looked at your evidence, reviewed by colleagues who had decided the conclusion before examining the data, rejected by journals whose gatekeepers had a financial and reputational stake in the theory your findings threatened. Imagine knowing that your work was being buried not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. That was the daily reality of Ruth Simpson and her team, and it was about to get worse. In the history of science, there are famous cases of paradigm-challenging researchers who suffered for their iconoclasm before being vindicated by subsequent evidence. Ignaz Semmelweis, who proposed that doctors were spreading disease through unwashed hands, was institutionalized. Alfred Wegener, who proposed continental drift, was mocked by an entire generation of geologists. Barry Marshall, who proved that stomach ulcers were caused by a bacterium rather than stress, was dismissed as a crank before winning the Nobel Prize. The story of Louis Leakey and Ruth Simpson at Calico belongs to this tradition, but it has a particular ferocity that distinguishes it from the usual scientific conservatism, because what happened to the Calico researchers was not merely professional marginalization. It was a sustained, targeted campaign to destroy their credibility. And it succeeded. The dismantling of Louis Leakey. By the late 1960s, Louis Leakey was in his mid-60s and in deteriorating health. He had suffered a series of health crises. He was visibly aging, and his association with the Calico site, a cause that had become increasingly unpopular in American archaeological circles, was being used against him in ways that went beyond scientific disagreement. The characterization of Leakey's support for Calico as evidence of mental decline began to appear in professional discussions, in seminars and conference hallways, in correspondence between established scholars. The suggestion was planted: Leakey was old. Leakey was confused. Leakey's famous instinct for significance had curdled, in his final years, into an inability to distinguish genuine discoveries from wishful thinking. The Calico endorsement was not evidence of a great scientist's judgment. It was evidence of a great scientist's deterioration. This characterization was cruel. It was also strategically brilliant, because it allowed the establishment to dismiss the Calico findings without engaging with them. You did not need to refute the evidence. You simply needed to suggest that the man who had endorsed the evidence was no longer capable of reliable judgment. Attach the discrediting of the messenger to the dismissal of the message, and you have accomplished your goal without doing any actual science. In the 1970s, as Leakey's health continued to decline, the attacks became more open. Papers appeared in print, not in fringe publications but in respected journals, that characterized his support for Calico as an embarrassing late-career mistake. Some of these critiques were written by people who had known Leakey personally, who had worked alongside him, who owed significant parts of their careers to his mentorship. They wrote about his Calico enthusiasm with the clinical detachment of a physician describing a patient's symptoms. Louis Leakey died in October 1972. By the time of his death, his association with the Calico site had become, in some circles of his profession, a source of regret rather than pride. The great man, people said quietly, had made a mistake. The evidence had been too thin. The excitement of one final discovery had overwhelmed his usually reliable, critical faculties. These people were wrong, but they were also powerful, and for decades their assessment prevailed. The long siege of Ruth Simpson. Ruth Simpson did not have the luxury of dying with her reputation partially intact. She lived until 2000, and she spent the last 3 decades of her life watching the work she had dedicated her career to, dismissed, derided, and deliberately buried. After Leakey's death, the institutional support for the Calico project began to erode. National Geographic's involvement diminished. Academic partnerships became harder to maintain. The professional atmosphere around the site had curdled badly enough that association with Calico carried a real reputational cost, and fewer established scholars were willing to pay it. Funding dried up, not all at once, not with a formal announcement, but gradually, through the withdrawal of grants, the non-renewal of support, the quiet institutional decisions that accumulate into financial strangulation. The excavation team found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation, committed to continuing the work, but with fewer and fewer resources to continue it with. They continued anyway. This is perhaps the most extraordinary detail of the entire Calico story. As the institutional support collapsed, as the funding dried up, as the professional atmosphere around the site became actively hostile, the core excavation team did not quit. They worked with their own money. They worked on weekends and on vacation days. They worked in temperatures that in summer exceeded 104 degrees Fahrenheit, doing the careful, back-breaking work of controlled stratigraphic excavation in the Mojave Desert, without pay, without recognition, without the professional infrastructure that serious archaeological research requires. They did this for decades because they believed they had found something real, and because they were not willing to let the establishment's contempt transform into the site's abandonment. The personal cost to Ruth Simpson was incalculable. She was not simply professionally marginalized. She was labeled a fanatic, a zealot, an obsessive who had lost the capacity for objective judgment. Her decades of meticulous fieldwork at Calico were characterized, in certain professional contexts, not as evidence of scientific dedication, but as evidence of an unhealthy fixation. The implication was that Simpson had become so personally invested in the site's significance that she could no longer evaluate it honestly. This characterization is worth pausing on because it reveals something deeply ugly about the dynamics of the controversy. Ruth Simpson was a professional archaeologist with decades of experience. She had not stumbled onto the Calico site by accident. She had been systematically surveying the Calico Hills for years before making her most significant discoveries. She had responded to every technical objection with technical analysis. She had invited critical review, welcomed independent examination, published her data in detail. She had done, in other words, exactly what rigorous scientific inquiry requires. And her reward for this rigorous, dedicated, evidence-based pursuit was to be called a fanatic by people who had not done the work she had done, had not examined the evidence she had examined, and had not spent a single day in the Mojave desert heat, earning the right to an informed opinion. Ruth Simpson died in 2000. The Calico site was still being excavated. The question of its significance was still unresolved. She did not live to see the vindication that subsequent decades would begin, slowly and haltingly, to offer. What institutional suppression actually looks like it is important to be precise about what happened at Calico, because suppression is a word that gets thrown around carelessly and can mean many things. The Calico case was not suppression in the conspiratorial sense. There was no secret committee meeting, no explicit agreement to bury the evidence, no coordinated campaign with a central director. What happened was more banal, and in some ways, more disturbing. It was a community of professionals trained to believe that a particular answer was correct, responding to inconvenient evidence with the full suite of social and institutional mechanisms available to them. Peer review used to exclude rather than evaluate. Funding decisions made on the basis of paradigm alignment rather than methodological quality. Professional networks deployed to marginalize rather than engage. Reputational attacks substituted for actual scientific analysis. None of these mechanisms required a conspiracy. They required only the ordinary human tendency to protect what one has invested in, to respond defensively to challenges to one's worldview, and to use whatever power one has to suppress the anxiety that genuine uncertainty produces. Science, at its best, is designed to counteract these tendencies. Peer review, replication requirements, open data policies, adversarial collaboration. These are all tools for combating the confirmation bias and territorial defensiveness that the Calico case illustrates in such painful detail. But these tools only work if the community using them is committed to letting the evidence, rather than the paradigm, be the final arbiter. In the case of Calico, that commitment failed. And the cost was paid, not by the establishment that failed, but by the individuals who had done the work. Meanwhile, beneath the Mojave sand, the stones waited, patient, unchanged, entirely indifferent to the political and institutional dramas being conducted in their name. Science does not always vindicate the persecuted. Sometimes the suppressed claim turns out to have been wrong. The history of science is full of cases where an establishment that resisted an unorthodox claim turned out to be right to resist it, where the iconoclast was not a visionary but simply mistaken, and where the professional skepticism that felt like suppression was actually doing its proper job. The question for Calico has always been, which kind of case is this? And in the early years of the 21st century, a series of developments began to complicate that question in ways that made simple dismissal increasingly difficult. The first cracks, pre-Clovis sites, multiply. The Clovis first paradigm began to crack long before the most dramatic recent discoveries. The cracks appeared gradually, over decades, as site after site produced evidence of human presence in the Americas that predated the Clovis horizon. Monte Verde, in southern Chile, was the most significant early challenger. Chilean archaeologist Tom Dillahay began excavating the site in the 1970s and found evidence of human occupation: hearths, food remains, wooden implements, stone tools, dating to approximately 14,500 years before the present. That is 1,500 years before the Clovis tradition's earliest dates. Monteverde faced years of skepticism, methodological challenge, and professional resistance that echoed the Calico experience in disturbing ways. Then, in 1997, a team of leading archaeologists that included several prominent Clovis first adherents visited the site, examined the evidence in person, and publicly acknowledged that Monteverde represented a legitimate pre-Clovis occupation. The endorsement was a watershed moment. It did not resolve the question of how much earlier humans had been in the Americas, but it definitively established that Clovis first, as an absolute principle rather than a best current estimate, was wrong. Humans had been in the Americas before Clovis. The question had shifted, not whether pre-Clovis was possible, but how far back the evidence extended. White Sands, 23,000 years and counting. In September 2021, a paper published in the journal Science announced a finding that recalibrated the entire discussion of early human presence in the Americas. At White Sands National Park in New Mexico, a team of researchers had identified and dated a series of fossilized human footprints preserved in ancient lake sediment. The footprints were real, unambiguous, and unmistakably human, not the kind of evidence whose interpretation required extensive technical argument. They were footprints of people walking across wet mud at the edge of a Pleistocene lake, and they dated to between 21,000 and 23,000 years before the present. This placed human beings in North America during the last glacial maximum, the period of peak glaciation, when enormous ice sheets covered much of the northern continent, and when the ice-free corridor route typically proposed for the Clovis migration was, according to most models, impassable or non-existent. If humans were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, walking around, going about their daily lives, leaving their footprints in the mud of an ancient lake, then the entire story of how and when and by what route human beings entered the Americas required fundamental revision. The White Sands discovery was received by the field with a combination of excitement and careful scrutiny. The dating methodology was subjected to rigorous review. Some researchers raised questions about whether the dated plant material might have been subject to a reservoir effect, ancient carbon in the groundwater artificially inflating the radiocarbon ages. Additional dating was undertaken using alternative methods. The debate continues, with some studies supporting the original dates and others raising concerns. But even allowing for the full range of uncertainty in the dating, the White Sands footprints pushed the timeline of human presence in North America substantially earlier than Clovis. And they did so with a form of evidence, actual human footprints, that was difficult to dismiss or reinterpret. In the context of Calico, the White Sands discovery was significant for what it implied about the range of the possible. If humans were demonstrably in North America 23,000 years ago, then the question was no longer whether pre-Clovis was possible. The question was how far back the evidence could eventually be pushed. The Cerruti Mastodon, 130,000 years in Southern California. And then came the Cerruti Mastodon site. Located in San Diego, in Southern California, the same broad geographic region as the Calico site, the Cerruti Mastodon site was initially excavated in 1992 during a routine highway construction project. The site contained the fossilized remains of a mastodon, a large elephant-like animal that roamed North America during the Pleistocene epoch. The bones were found in association with large cobbles that showed evidence of being used as hammerstones, along with bone fragments that appeared to have been deliberately broken. The site sat in relative obscurity for years, its significance unrecognized. Then, in 2017, a team of researchers published a paper in the journal Nature presenting their analysis of the Cerruti assemblage. Their conclusion: the mastodon bones had been processed by a hominin using stone tools approximately 130,000 years ago. 130,000 years ago, in Southern California. The paper used uranium series dating on the bones and teeth, a radiometric technique independent of radiocarbon and capable of dating materials up to several 100,000 years old. Multiple specimens were dated. The results were consistent. The geological context was carefully documented. The fracture patterns on the bones were analyzed and compared to modern reference collections of intentionally broken bone. The response to the Cerruti paper was intense and divided. Supporters argued that the evidence was rigorous, the dating methodology sound, and the fracture patterns on the bones consistent with intentional processing rather than natural breakage. If accepted, the finding would place a hominin, species not yet specified, but some member of the genus Homo, in California, more than 100,000 years before the previously accepted earliest date of human presence in the Americas. Critics argued that the fracture patterns could be explained by natural processes, the compression of overlying sediment, the activity of heavy construction equipment during the 1992 excavation, other geological forces. The absence of identifiable hominin skeletal material was pointed out as a significant evidentiary gap. The dating was questioned on methodological grounds. The debate has not been resolved. The Cerruti Mastodon site remains one of the most contested claims in contemporary American archaeology. But consider what this controversy means for the story of Calico. 40 years ago, the idea that any hominin had been present in California 130,000 years ago was so far outside the bounds of acceptable scientific discussion that raising it seriously in an academic forum would have been professionally damaging. Today, a paper making precisely that claim was published in Nature, the most prestigious scientific journal in the world, and while it is contested as a legitimate scientific claim, requiring engagement and evaluation, not as a fringe fantasy to be dismissed without examination. The Overton window of what is scientifically permissible to claim about early human presence in the Americas has shifted dramatically, and it has shifted in exactly the direction that the Calico researchers were pointing. In the Mojave Desert, in the 1950s and 1960s, at enormous personal professional cost. Advanced dating technologies and Calico revisited. The development of more sophisticated dating technologies has also opened new possibilities for re-evaluating sites like Calico that were initially assessed with the more limited techniques available in mid-20th century archaeology. Uranium series dating, optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, thermoluminescence, electron spin resonance, and paleomagnetic dating now provide multiple independent chronometric tools that can be applied to geological deposits in ways that were not available to the Calico team in the 1960s and 1970s. OSL dating in particular offers significant potential for sites like Calico because it measures the last time individual mineral grains were exposed to light, essentially dating the moment of sediment deposition directly rather than relying on organic material for radiocarbon analysis. For a site where the challenge has always been establishing a precise chronological relationship between the sediment and the lithic specimens it contains, OSL represents a potentially powerful analytical tool. The Calico site has not yet been subject to the comprehensive redating program that modern technology would allow. The institutional and funding obstacles that plagued the original excavation continue to limit research possibilities. But the potential exists, and the broader point is this: the scientific context in which Calico must now be evaluated is dramatically different from the one in which it was first condemned. The absolute certainty of Clovis first is gone. The possibility of very early human presence in the Americas, whether by Homo sapiens or by earlier hominins, is now a legitimate subject of serious scientific inquiry. The methodological tools available for evaluating that possibility are vastly more powerful than what existed in Ruth Simpson's day. The question is no longer whether Calico was asking a legitimate scientific question. It was. The question now is whether the field has the intellectual honesty to revisit the answer it enforced so ruthlessly for so long. We began this story in the Mojave Desert, in the stillness of a landscape where the past is written in stone and the present is an intrusion. We end it there, too. The Calico early man site still exists. The master pits, excavated by Ruth Simpson and her team, are still there, covered and preserved. The specimens, collected over decades of careful fieldwork, are still cataloged in collections at the San Bernardino County Museum. The geological deposits that generated this controversy are unchanged, unmoved, indifferent to the decades of argument conducted in their shadow. And the question that has always been at the center of this story remains, in important respects, unanswered. Were the stones of Calico made by human hands? What we know, what we don't hear, is an honest assessment of where the evidence stands. The Calico lithic assemblage is real. 11,000 specimens, carefully documented, consistently recovered from controlled stratigraphic contexts in a well-understood geological formation. The assemblage exists. The question is what it means. The geological dating of the Yermo Formation is consistent and independently supported. The deposit is old, Middle Pleistocene old, in the range of 100,000 to 200,000 years. The specimens from the master pits were recovered in situ from this deposit. This is not disputed by the most rigorous critics. The diagnostic features of the Calico specimens, the bulbs of percussion, the platform preparation, the systematic flake morphology, are real and documented. The question is whether they are exclusively explainable by human action or whether natural geogenic processes could have produced them. The honest answer is that this question has not been definitively resolved, not because the evidence is too weak to evaluate. but because the evaluation was never done rigorously and fairly. What passed for scientific consensus on Calico was, as we have seen, largely a consensus of dismissal rather than a consensus of thorough investigation. The possibility remains, not a certainty, not even a probability currently supported by the weight of evidence, but a genuine scientific possibility that Calico represents evidence of human or hominin presence in the Americas substantially earlier than any site previously accepted. The Cerruti Mastodon site, 130,000 years old, in the same region of California, demonstrates that such extreme antiquity is no longer beyond the pale of scientific consideration. If Calico stones are artifacts rather than geofacts, they may represent the most important archaeological discovery ever made in North America. If they are geofacts, they represent a cautionary tale about the dangers of wishful interpretation in the face of ambiguous evidence. We do not yet know which story is true, and that uncertainty, after 7 decades of controversy, is itself a damning indictment of how the scientific community chose to respond to this site. The system that failed. Whether or not the Calico stones are genuine human artifacts, the story of how science responded to the claim that they were is unambiguously a story of institutional failure. The peer review process failed. Manuscripts were rejected not on the basis of methodological flaws, but on the basis of their conclusions. Reviewers dismissed findings they had not examined. Journals published critiques from scholars who had not done the work. The funding system failed. Resources were directed away from a research program, not because the program was poorly executed, but because its findings were politically inconvenient for the field's dominant paradigm. The norms of professional conduct failed. Researchers were personally attacked. Their competence was questioned. Their mental capacity was invoked as an explanation for their conclusions. Scientific disagreement became personal assault, and the self-correcting mechanism that is supposed to be science's greatest strength, the willingness to revise conclusions in light of new evidence, failed catastrophically. Evidence that challenged Clovis first was not evaluated on its merits. It was excluded from serious consideration before it had a chance to accumulate. This failure did not happen because scientists are uniquely corrupt or uniquely small-minded. It happened because scientists are human beings, subject to the same cognitive biases, social pressures, and territorial instincts as everyone else. The mythology of scientific objectivity, the idea that researchers are capable of evaluating evidence entirely free of prior commitments and social interests, is not just false, it is dangerous, because it creates the illusion of accountability without the reality of it. Science works not because individual scientists are objective. Science works when its institutional structures force systematic engagement with evidence, even inconvenient evidence. When those structures fail, as they failed at Calico, science stops being science and becomes something else. Something that wears the costume of truth-seeking while actually protecting established power. The cost paid by individuals. In the abstract, we can talk about paradigm shifts and institutional failures and the sociology of scientific knowledge. In the concrete, we should remember what this story cost the people at its center. Ruth Simpson spent her entire professional life, 50+ years, on a research program that her field refused to evaluate fairly. She worked in extreme conditions, without adequate support, against systematic professional opposition. She documented her findings rigorously. She engaged with criticism honestly. She invited review that she did not receive. She died in 2000, in her late 80s, still fighting for the significance of a site that subsequent decades have made at least plausible and possibly important. She died without vindication. She died without seeing the Clovis first paradigm fall. She died without seeing a Cerruti mastodon or a White Sands footprint demonstrate that the temporal range she was arguing for was not, as her critics insisted, absurd. Louis Leakey spent the final decade of his extraordinary career defending a site that his colleagues used as evidence of his deterioration. A man who had pushed human origins back millions of years in East Africa, who had done more than almost any individual to expand our understanding of where and when and how humanity emerged, was mocked in his final years as a credulous old man taken in by a desert enthusiast's wishful thinking. He died in 1972. His work at Olduvai Gorge remains foundational to our understanding of human evolution. His work at Calico remains contested. History has been kinder to him than his contemporaries were. The excavation team that worked the site through the years of institutional abandonment, the volunteers and underfunded professionals who showed up in the Mojave summer heat, season after season, because they believed they were doing important work, received nothing from the system they served. No recognition, no support, no honest engagement with what they had found. These are not abstractions. These are lives. Lives organized around a question that deserved to be taken seriously and was instead weaponized against the people asking it. Science as process, not scripture. The deepest lesson of the Calico story is not about archaeology. It is about the nature of knowledge itself. Science is not a collection of settled facts. It is a process, an ongoing, self-correcting, fallible human process for building reliable knowledge about the world. And the reliability comes not from the infallibility of individual scientists, but from the structural commitments of the enterprise to transparency, to replication, to honest engagement with contrary evidence, to the willingness to follow the data wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. When those structural commitments are undermined by career incentives, by paradigm entrenchment, by the ordinary human desire to protect what one has built, the process stops being science. It becomes something that looks like science from the outside, but functions, on the inside, more like theology. A body of doctrine protected by its custodians against the corruption of doubt. The Clovis first paradigm, in its later decades, operated more like theology than like science. And the people who enforced it, who rejected evidence without examination, who attacked researchers rather than arguments, who used institutional power to prevent the accumulation of contrary findings, were not acting as scientists. They were acting as believers. That distinction matters enormously, because if we do not understand how scientific communities can fail, if we maintain the comfortable mythology that science is self-evidently and always what it claims to be, then we cannot identify or correct those failures when they occur. We become complicit in them. The Calico story is not a story about fringe science versus mainstream science. It is a story about what happens when the mainstream loses its commitment to the process that makes it worth listening to in the first place. The stones still wait there is a particular kind of power that belongs to physical evidence. Human arguments change. Institutional positions shift. Paradigms rise and fall. Reputations are built and destroyed and rehabilitated. The sociology of knowledge is turbulent and complicated and thoroughly human. But the stones in the Mojave Desert have not changed. They sit in their ancient sediment, as they have sat for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, entirely indifferent to the controversies conducted in their name. They do not care whether the professional consensus favors them or condemns them. They do not care what Ruth Simpson's reputation was at the end of her life, or how the scientific establishment characterized Louis Leakey's judgment in his final years. They are what they are. And whatever they are, human tools or nature's imitation of human tools, they represent something that the establishment found threatening enough to suppress, and that the evidence of subsequent decades has found interesting enough to reconsider. The Calico Early Man site still accepts visitors. You can walk the ground that Ruth Simpson walked. You can see, in the covered master pits, the stratigraphic profiles that her team documented with such care. You can hold, if you are fortunate enough to arrange access to the collections, the same stones that Louis Leakey turned in his hands 60 years ago and declared to be human artifacts. And you can ask, as they asked, the question that this landscape has been posing to every generation that has cared enough to come and look. Did someone stand here in this desert 200,000 years ago? Did they look out at the same hills under a different sky with a technology so ancient that we are still not sure how to recognize it for what it was? Did they leave, in the deliberate fracture of a stone, the trace of a mind working, thinking, planning, shaping the world to their purposes, in a place and a time that we had decided, comfortably and wrongly, was empty of thought? We don't know. We may never know with certainty. But the stones are still there, patient, unchanged, waiting for minds unencumbered by the dogmas of textbooks, unafraid of the professional cost of honest inquiry, willing to go into the desert heat and look at the evidence with fresh eyes and ask the question without already knowing the answer they are supposed to give. The Mojave does not offer easy revelations. It offers only silence and heat and the long, geological patience of a landscape that has been here far longer than any of our arguments about it. But sometimes, in that silence, if you are paying the right kind of attention, the stones speak. The question is whether we are finally ready to listen.